For World Autism Month, here's another fun fact about autism. Did you know that autism is not degenerative? Individuals can continuously improve, especially with specialized services and opportunities for inclusion. Hello there, this is Bradley, and you're listening to Psych Everywhere, a podcast by Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychological science to a diverse range of current events and to better your life. For today's episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Lydia Qualls again, this time to specifically discuss the idea and effects of perceiving autism spectrum disorder as a culture instead of a medical condition. As listeners of our previous episode may recall, Dr. Qualls is a licensed clinical psychologist at the Cook Counseling Center. She has conducted numerous research studies on autism and works with clients using a collaborative approach that integrates cognitive behavioral therapy and interpersonal process-oriented techniques. Dr. Qualls, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
My first topic on this part is, what are some challenges that autistic people face in college? And are those similar to what you might see in the workplace?
Yeah. So a lot of the challenges that autistic people face in college are the same as non-autistic college students, but they just affect autistic college students more. It's challenging for all college students, to transition to school from home, losing their support system, being in a more complex social environment. But for autistic people, transitions are a particular area of difficulty that can be from home, semester to semester. They may be losing their parents as a support system and friends. The complex social environment has an emphasis on socializing in a way that a lot of autistic people may not like, like loud, noisy parties. But there's also supports that can be accessed, like therapy from the college counseling centers, special interest groups, support groups, and academic support. You asked about challenges in the workplace, and I will say autistic people have one of the lowest, if not the lowest, employment rate of all disabilities, around 20%. Job interviews often focus on social interaction skills, even if the job itself doesn't involve social interaction. There's the stigma of autism. Having to constantly mask around people can lead to autistic burnout. Not having colleagues that understand autism, getting very overwhelmed. It can be a really difficult situation, especially if the person doesn't have access to a diagnosis and therefore accommodations, or they don't want to be, quote unquote, out as autistic to access those accommodations.
So I saw that you presented at SEPA on autism-as-culture, and I think I immediately fell in love with that idea.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little about that framework and how that's different from the traditional medical model?
Sure. So the autism-as-culture is a phrase that specifically comes from a 2013 article by Joseph Strauss that frames the so-called quote-unquote deficits of autism as differences similar to those you might see in other different sociolinguistic cultures, such as the capital D deaf culture, or a different country's culture, like in Japan. So the thing is, you wouldn't say that someone who's Japanese has been socialized to make less eye contact. You wouldn't say that their deficit are deficient in eye contact. So why would you say that about autism? When autistic people literally often experience physical pain or the same sensation of physical pain when making eye contact. The autism-as-culture model describes it in terms of local coherence. That means making connections differently than non-autistic people, fixity of focus, having more detailed and longer focus than non-autistic people, and private meanings. So having our own ways of thinking and communicating about the world. It doesn't see autism as a quote unquote problem that the person needs to overcome, but as a difference that society needs to understand, accept, and accommodate.
Why do you think that the framework is needed, and particularly how do autistic people respond to and benefit from it? I would imagine that they really appreciate being spoken to as a culture as opposed to that they have a medical problem or something, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of autistic people even though they may have like a felt sense of this framework, I don't know how many people are as familiar with it. I certainly wasn't until I had it mentioned to me by someone else in the disability community who is also autistic. But I feel like the framework is really needed for autistic people to be understood, accepted, accommodated, and welcomed into our culture at large and into also various microcosms of culture, such as schoolwork and social life. If you see someone as different but not deficient, you're much more likely to get to understand them person to person, you know. And it doesn't ignore the supports that autistic people need, but tries to include them for all in like a universal design way of thinking. Part of the reason we need this in our capitalistic society is the 80% unemployment rate for autistic people, but we also deserve to play and learn in more supportive ways too, not just work. And autistic people can benefit from it and improve self-esteem. External and internal acceptance of autism has been shown to decrease depression, anxiety, and even thoughts of suicide in autistic people. And it makes it easier to have relationships with other people when they understand you better. So it views autism as an identity you can accept and choose for yourself and support self-diagnosis, because it's very hard sometimes for adult autistic people to get a diagnosis, especially for all women and people assigned female at birth, and especially so for people of color.
I'm glad that you mentioned that the autism-as-culture framework is still kind of unheard of, because I know when I saw it mentioned in your abstract for SEPA, I was like, what? What is this? Am I just not in the loop? I wanted to hear more about it. Could you give an example of how you might apply it, that perspective or framework? Like, let's say an autistic person is challenged by some change in the environment, something like that.
Yeah, so I think fundamentally this is a strength-based approach, and you would apply it by using a person's strengths as well as seeking accommodation to the environment. So for changes, having as much notice ahead of time and as many details as possible is good, because it helps the autistic person from a local coherence or detail focused perspective. It might also benefit the autistic person to think about what this change means to them for the private meanings part and how they can support themselves through this change. So stimming, seeking comfort through special interest with a fixity of focus characteristic. Also, it's important for autistic people to be able to advocate for ourselves and not see ourselves as the problem, to be able to ask for support that we need to navigate the challenge or change.
And what about like let's say another example, sexuality and romantic relationships for autistic people? How might the framework be used then to kind of help a relationship thrive?
First of all, just really understanding how your autistic partner expresses care and affection. And I think this is important again for all relationships. Knowing that they may have some difficulty being as spontaneous with romantic gestures and like things more planned out. But things, I heard the example one time, I'm forgetting where, of, just because it isn't spontaneous to the autistic person doesn't mean it doesn't seem spontaneous to the partner. Like we can make a schedule of, oh, buy flowers, surprise her with this, and the other person doesn't know about it, so it still seems spontaneous like a surprise, but it's something that has been planned in advance. Also paying attention to like sensory differences and different, romantic and intimate contexts can be really important for autistic people. Again, communication is the key, and understanding how your partner communicates. I know my partner and I have, when I'm feeling particularly nonverbal, I have like particular hand signals that I can give her, and she knows to wait and give me a minute.
Those are actually really great examples. I just love this idea of coming at the autism from like a cross-cultural perspective, really. If I or someone else wanted to study or apply this in greater detail, where should we go? Do you have some preferred resources?
Well, my first referral source would be the original article by Joseph Strauss, and also the articles written that cite it. I would also suggest, as much as possible, listening to autistic people in what they want to be researched and what they want in terms of support, which I think is more important than any academic source. That's why the places I refer people to when they're exploring an autism diagnosis is the autistic community on Instagram and other social media platforms, as well as books written by autistic people, such as Loud Hands, Autistic People Speaking, published by the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network.
I read that, kind of flipping this topic around the other way, I read that culture can actually affect whether people are diagnosed with autism. And I thought that was really interesting too. I had never heard that said quite that way either. Could you elaborate on that and what the implications might be for people outside the US and Western Europe who might not be diagnosed because their autism behaviors are actually in line with their culture, like shyness and not making eye contact and things like that?
Yeah, I think the reason that culture affects the diagnosis so much is because diagnoses in general are primarily created by and given by Western providers who may not be as familiar with other cultures. So they may overdiagnose behavior like avoidance of eye contact in Japanese people, or underdiagnose, for example, an Italian child who makes a lot of hand gestures because it's a bigger part of the Italian language. Of course, Italian is still Western, and there are differences in between some Western cultures too. It's just important for clinicians to be familiar with the culture of the person that they're working with and the cultural norms of that culture. I would just say for any diagnosis, the reason it's a diagnosable condition or a difference that people identify with is because it is in some way out of the ordinary for the culture and disruptive either to the person or the environment. So I would focus more on where does the person have difficulties? Is it hard for them to understand and perform the social norms of that culture, whatever they may be? Do they have sensory sensitivities that make it harder for them to do things expected of them? Just in general, what are the difficulties for that person and how does it affect their life? Difficulties with diagnosis is also why it's important to accept self-diagnosis in autistic people.
Over the years that you've been studying autism now, have your views changed on it over the years?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely came in with a more medicalized perspective. And you can even tell from some of like earlier presentations I did and presenting my master's thesis and dissertation, really talking more about diagnosis and deficit. And until I started to identify more as autistic myself, but also even before that, listen to the autistic community and seeing, how people felt about how they were referred to, and I could really understand why it would be demoralizing to hear people refer to you that way, and people do a bunch of research on you and you not have any say in it, and say on what topics are covered, not have any say on how autistic people are represented. So that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this podcast and identifying as autistic, is because I think it's really important for autistic researchers in the field to be able to share their voices and share the voices of those with autism not in the field, so that we can do research and offer supports that are more in line with the wants and needs of autistic people.
Great answer. We kind of started this talking about challenges faced in college and in the workplace. Could you name any famous or successful real life people with autism in the workplace?
Well, I may not be famous, but I feel like I'm pretty successful.
Uh-huh.
And I also know Temple Grandin is an autistic woman that is often pointed to in terms of how she used her special interests to innovate in her field of animal science, inventing a machine to help cows feel less afraid, when going through the slaughter process. Elon Musk is also a very successful figure. No matter what you think about him politically, he stated he has autism, or Asperger's specifically. And it's something that's not always spoken about because of the stigma and difficulties. So I actually had to Google successful autistic people to continue to answer this question. The source I found mentioned people like Dan Aykroyd and Susan Boyle. And I also knew of the comedian Hannah Gadsby. And these are people who succeeded in more non-conventional work settings. And there's also climate activist Greta Thunberg, who's autistic. So autistic people often have the most success outside of a traditional work environment, or when they're given the leeway to adapt the work environment to meet their needs.
Well, is there anything that I've missed or any other topics that you had that you'd like to discuss?
One thing I would like to discuss, I know it's a little bit controversial, is applied behavioral analysis. A lot of times it's seen kind of as the gold standard of autism treatment. And it's basically shaping a child's behavior so that they mask their autistic traits more. A lot of autistic adults now really felt traumatized by that treatment as children. And there's a lot of people in the autism community that speak out about it. But I can't remember if this podcast or the last one I mentioned some autistic self-advocates, specifically Black female autistic self-advocates on Instagram, such as Fidgets and Fries, talking about how having Black autistic sons, and that sometimes ABA is the only therapy available, and also sometimes it's necessary to teach masking for the safety of Black children or not children of color who are autistic, just because of racial violence and that kind of thing, violence against people of color.
What about microaggressions? So on the show, we did a whole episode on microaggressions for people of color, and then we did one for people with disabilities. Are there specifically some microaggressions in the workplace or in college that people with autism sometimes experience?
Yes, I'm looking back through my PowerPoint because I had a whole slide on what not to say to an autistic person. This comes from S. Wilson on her, I think Doodle Beth is their handle on Instagram and Twitter. So things not to say include you don't look autistic, because autism doesn't necessarily have a particular look. And there's also a wonderful book by that title, You Don't Look Autistic at All, by a Dutch autistic woman, Bianca Topes, that's her name. And I would encourage people to read that book to find out more about autism from a woman's perspective. Saying things like everyone is a bit autistic or we're all on the spectrum, it really kind of downplays the specific challenges faced by autistic people. And then things like you must be high functioning, or like, so you're like Sheldon, assuming people, overlooking again the challenges or really stereotyping us based on, one prominent autistic representation. Things like, is there a cure? Don't let autism define you. It talks about autism as something separate from the person and not, intrinsic or an identity or a positive thing. Saying things like everyone struggles with stuff like that. Autism is overdiagnosed. You're nothing like my autistic child. Oh, you mean Asperger's? You're not really autistic. Kind of, again, like really downplaying the autistic identity and the difficulty someone with autistic has, and downplaying the validity of autism as an identity.
Anything else that I've missed?
I think that's everything that I wanted to talk about. Yeah.
I think this went really fantastic.
Awesome.
You had so many great examples and they were easy to relate to. Yeah, I just really appreciate you doing this with me.
Thank you. I appreciate so much being asked.
You've just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere. If you haven't already listened to our other episode with Dr. Qualls about common misconceptions about autism, I encourage you to go ahead and do so today. I'll put a link to it in the show notes for this episode. Did you know that diversity-related content published in Psi Chi's magazine and journal is automatically eligible for a chance to receive a $600 Diversity Article Award? We would love to receive a submission from you about a diversity-related topic. There's a bunch to choose from, such as race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, age, physical and other disabilities, religion, socioeconomic background, non-traditional students, first-generation students, and plenty more too, I'm sure. I'll put a link in the show notes for this award as well. If you haven't already subscribed to Psych Everywhere, go ahead and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. Tell a friend or a colleague about the show. Word of mouth is a huge help for podcasts. So, share what you learned the next time you're catching up with an old friend or in your classes. You can also follow us on Twitter at Psi Chi Podcast and leave a review at Apple Podcast or wherever you go for podcasts. You'll absolutely make my day, and more importantly, you'll be helping us to get psych everywhere. Okay, that's all for now. I'll connect with you again soon. Copyright 2022, Psi Chi, the International Honor Society in Psychology. All rights reserved.